Hello, thank you for listening to Thyroid Hair Loss Connection podcast, a science-based, honest, candid conversation about how your thyroid affects your hair. You will learn practical solutions to hair growth, healing your thyroid, and balancing hormones with holistic nutrition approach and the latest treatments. Your hosts, me, Nataliia Sanzo, a registered dietitian aka Nashville thyroid expert, and Kimberly Vaughn, a board-certified trichologist, hair loss specialist, and coach. To stay up to date on the latest topics, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We also cannot do this without you. Send us a question to the link below and tune in each week for the answers. Now, let's head to the show. Today's bonus episode is prepared for you by two Hashimoto dietitians, myself, Nataliia Sanzo, and Ingrid Anderson, who is a registered dietitian nutritionist and fellow Hashi warrior. She lives in upstate New York, and before becoming a dietitian, she had many uncontrolled Hashimoto symptoms, including fatigue, adult acne, weight gain, and difficulty losing weight despite taking thyroid medication. Through nutrition changes, she was able to lose 55 pounds and ditch all of her Hashimoto symptoms. She now helps other Hashi warriors like herself lose weight and live symptoms-free. Let's welcome Ingrid. Hi, Ingrid. We're so happy to have you on our podcast. We're so excited. We've been pumping up our social media, sharing little tips and tricks, or sharing the topics we're going to cover on this podcast with our listeners. And a lot of them submitted their questions, and we're going to try to cover them on this episode. So we're so excited to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here too. I think we're going to have an awesome conversation. I think we're going to bring so much value to both of our audiences. So thank you so much for having me.
Yes, of course. And just to let our listeners kind of into the backstory of how we met and how this podcast or this episode even came to life. Just wanted to share a little bit of background. So I think I found you about 6 months ago on Instagram, and I thought, oh my God, there is another amazing dietitian, does amazing things, supporting her community. So I started following you because I love seeing what other people are doing, right? So, and only a few weeks ago, I reached out to you because I thought, how can we support our community better? And I thought to myself, what can be better than one Hashimoto dietitian, two Hashimoto dietitians, right? So I reached out to you and asked you if you want to be on my podcast. And you said yes right away. You got excited, kind of pumped me up. So here we are.
Yeah. And I'm so excited. This is something that I love about the Hashimoto space too, is how supportive Hashimoto's dietitians specifically are of each other. And we are all here to help women with Hashimoto's feel better. And I think that's why we bond so closely together with each other, is because we have that, that unanimous mission of helping people feel better. Cause I think we've all been there ourselves. So, I think that was really cool. And thank you so much for reaching out to me.
Yes, of course. And thank you for being open to doing a podcast. It was hard for us to decide what topic we wanted to cover. This is our first episode together. And of course, we want to cover as much ground as possible. And there is so much to talk about in Hashimoto world. So you had a great idea last night. So we're recording today, right? You had a great idea last night that you wanted to ask our listeners to submit questions. And we had so many of them reach out saying, oh my God, please, can you cover this question? So I think this is exactly what we're going to do today.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it's so important to hear from our audience too, in terms of what they want to hear from us, right? Because we're coming at it from a dietitian perspective, and what might be interesting to us might not be interesting to them. So I'm really excited that we were able to do that.
Awesome. Well, before we jump into this frequently asked questions, right? Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? I thought you had a great idea when we talked before we started recording. You asked, did you become a dietitian before or Hashimoto happened before? So tell us a little your story. How did you come into this world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got my Hashimoto's diagnosis before I became a dietitian. So, my mom has Hashimoto's. As most people know, it does run in families. So she kind of saw the writing on the wall. I was a competitive swimmer. I was swimming 2 hours a day and cross training, exercising 6, 7 days a week, dieting, because as a swimmer, you have to diet. Well, you don't have to, but they encourage it. So I was, eating about 900 calories a day, maybe even less sometimes. I was working out 6, 7 days a week, and I was just gaining tons of weight. And I'm sure listeners can empathize with this. I was 16, 17 years old. And regardless of all the working out and all of the, the dieting, I was just gaining weight, like day after day, until I had gained over 55 pounds. And, I was lifeguarding at the time, and it was the middle of July here in New York. So it was 98 degrees, and I was sitting there with like a hoodie on, right? So I was like freezing, sitting on the stand, 98 degrees. My mom was like, we're taking you to the doctor. We're getting your antibodies tested. And, back then, that was not very common to check antibodies. So I'm really grateful that she kind of saw the writing on the wall, had that experience, was able to get me tested. And then when I went to see a endocrinologist, I was just so devastated by the lack of information and how I was really, it felt like I was being blamed for the weight gain. She gave me Synthroid, like a low dose of Synthroid. I ended up not losing any of the weight. It was really frustrating to me. I was like, this is, even at that young age, I was like, there's gotta be something nutrition and lifestyle that I can do to help myself. I always knew like, there's gotta be something that I can do to help relieve my symptoms. I had horrible cystic acne, hairs falling out. I had psoriasis. I was bloated all the time. Like, I was really uncomfortable. And so that led me into going to school for nutrition to become a dietitian. And once I was able to put all those pieces together, and learning about metabolism and, all of those things, how the thyroid functions, I realized how much I was doing everything wrong, right? Like all of those restrictions. Dieting. Atkins was a big thing then. So going super low carb. So I realized I was also over exercising. So I realized through, not only my classical education, but because I was interested in Hashimoto's, anytime I got to choose a topic on a term paper or whatever, I would always make it Hashimoto's related. So I could learn more about it. And so I found out that everything I was doing that I thought was right was wrong. And once I was able to implement what I had learned from the literature back then, I was able to essentially ditch all my symptoms. I lost all the weight. I felt really good. And then I was like, okay, I got to do this for other people, right? Like there's such a gap here. And I'm, again, so devastated by the information from my doctor. I actually went through like 5 different endocrinologists before I found one that I liked.
Very, very common. Yes.
Yeah. So my story is the same as so many of my clients, right? Same. I'm sure you see that too. Like, I'm sure I'm like ringing all sorts of bells in your head too. I'm like, that is like the story that we hear, so often. And, I thought that your story on this was really cool too.
Yeah. So we're in the same space, but how we got here is different. I was opposite from you. I became a dietitian first, and only 3 years after I graduated with a dietetic degree, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's. So for me, when I got out of school, of course, I wanted to do weight loss. That's all everybody wants to do, or sports, to be a sports dietitian, because that it's cool, follow a low carb diet and keto and be vegan and all that stuff. And there I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's. It was devastating to me because I didn't really want to go that route to treat, to treat autoimmune disease and to be in that space. But then I realized that if I don't do it for myself, then how can I help other people? So I completely scratched all the other ideas and realized, like you said, that I was doing everything wrong. exercising twice a day. I was going to the gym in the morning and in the evening.
Right. And, I think, we aren't getting results, right? We aren't getting where we want to go. So we just end up packing more and more. And we think that that's how we can control our weight and that's how we can control our symptoms. But really Hashimoto's is, I know there's a lot of hate on Hashimoto's, but I almost find that it's a really beautiful thing because it really pushes us into this space of balance, right? Mm-hmm. It pushes us into caring for our bodies and nourishing our bodies and really finding a balance between wellness and health and stress management, for me, it was almost a good thing because I'm such an extreme personality, right? Like for me, I'm the type of person where I'm all about extremes, but Hashimoto's really forced me to focus on balance. And I think that that's kind of the beautiful thing about this.
Yes, exactly. And we're thinking about that we're treating an autoimmune disease or following a diet. But if you think the way we're approaching it, like you said, stress management, eating whole foods, eating anti-inflammatory diet, we're not actually treating anything. This is a normal way of life. This is how things are supposed to be. So we're not on a Hashimoto's diet. We're just on the normal pattern of eating, the way our bodies were supposed to be fed and taken care of.
True. And what I always tell my clients is, your symptoms are messages, right? Like every symptom you have is your body telling us what it needs. And, we certainly have less wiggle room than the general public to do things like eating processed foods or maybe we don't have, depending on where you are in your healing journey, you might not have the capacity to, go for as long of a hike or whatever it is you want to do. There tends to be a little bit less wiggle room, but it, again, forces us into that balance. It forces us into taking care of ourselves. So
exactly.
And I think that's kind of a way to just spin that, that mentality about it. Cause I think people are so negative when they find out that they have this diagnosis because it's really confusing and overwhelming. But when you think about the silver linings of this is you have no choice but to take care of yourself, right?
Yes. Yes. And instead of feeling like we're victims, we need to feel like we're empowered. We're empowered to take charge of our health. And, to our listeners, listening to a podcast like this is a huge step because that's what the more you learn, the more you know, the better care you can take care of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that is knowing what information is real and knowing what information is either like buzzwords or an influencer maybe caught on to this concept and then totally blew it out of proportion. That's one of the things too, it's so important, I think, to get your nutrition information from dietitians because we have such a very tight ethical margin here, right? We're not going to tell you something that's not true. And I think that that's so empowering to know kind of what you can kind of hone in on in terms of even scrolling through social media and what to kind of swipe past on. So absolutely.
Exactly. And speaking of, that we're not going to tell information that is not reliable. Not only that, but we back every word we say, it's backed up by research. We spent, 5 years total in school, 4 years undergrad, a year in clinical practice to study human body. So we know where it all starts and how to treat it. Okay, Ingrid, since we're talking about science-based studies and information, is there a best diet for Hashimoto's? Because I'm sure when our listeners Google this, the things that come up on Google are just, first scary and second dangerous. So let's talk about the best science-based best diets for Hashimoto's.
Yeah. So the things that you'll Google are absolutely wacky. And this is one of the most popular questions that I get is what diet is best, right? And people want kind of a quick, snappy answer. And it always fills me with anxiety because it's a hard question to answer because the truth is it's not a one size fits all thing, right? So there are certain concepts that we know, like eating anti-inflammatory, regulating your blood sugar with balanced meals, trialing gluten-free to see if that works for you, to see if that helps decrease your antibodies, potentially decreasing dairy or eliminating dairy. So all of these things that we know are backed by the literature, but it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach. Everyone has a different schedule, a different lifestyle. They have different needs, different comorbidities. There's so many things with Hashimoto's generally. Some people have celiac, some people have PCOS, insulin resistance. So there's not one diet that is the best for Hashimoto's, in my opinion.
Yes, absolutely. For example, celiac and Hashimoto's, they coexist. A lot of people with Hashimoto's have celiacs and vice versa. So we know that celiac disease has one best diet, which is gluten-free. And it just turned out that Hashimoto's patients benefit from being on gluten-free diet as well. This diet is the most researched. And there are studies that show that following a gluten-free diet actually not only reduces inflammation, but reduces antibodies. And we know that antibodies are kind of like a hallmark of the progression of your disease. They not necessarily show how your thyroid is being destroyed or how aggressive your disease is. But research does show that people that have high TPO antibodies level have more hypothyroidism symptoms.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, there's a lot of resistance in the Hashimoto's crowd for going gluten. Well, we kind of have two groups of people, right? We have the people that really do not want to go gluten-free or trial dairy-free either. And then we have the group of people that head more into the restrictive route of like AIP, elimination diets, all of those. But what we know is that based on the literature, based on our clients, right, based on the success that we've seen with our clients, is that it is so worth going gluten-free, even for 90 days. Give yourself a 90-day trial period to see how much better you feel after that time. And you will be convinced that, choosing a gluten-free alternative is 100% worth it.
Absolutely. And we actually, Ashley asked the question, do I really have to avoid gluten if I have Hashimoto's? And that's the most frequently asked question. But I do want to say that there is more than enough scientific evidence and clinical evidence. They show the benefits of gluten-free and actually dairy-free diet as well, because the dairy molecules and gluten molecules, they cross-react. And we know, not to bring that up in this podcast episode, but we know that about 90% of people with Hashimoto's have leaky gut, right? That's a syndrome. That's a condition where your gut wall kind of becomes permeable, that food particles or molecules like gluten and dairy, they get into your system. They don't get straight into your blood, and that's where the confusion comes from. It comes into that... It's called GALT system. That's where the whole systemic inflammation happens. And the problem is that gluten and dairy molecules, they resemble our thyroid hormone molecules. So I always advise my clients to follow gluten and dairy-free diet because of this concept, what we called molecular mimicry. That's what means that when the gluten and dairy molecules are similar to our thyroid gland, and when our immune system recognizes gluten and dairy as invaders, then it also attacks our thyroid gland, cells. So I would say definitely if you have Hashimoto's, you probably want to follow a gluten-free diet.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And, I have some clients that are really resistant in terms of, one or the other. So it's like, let's start with one, right? Let's start with gluten because that has a much bigger body of research around it. Let's at least start there and then see how you feel with dairy too, right? Because we individualize these things for people. So, I think that it's really important also as you're coming into your, as I like to call it, a Hashimoto's healing journey, is you don't have to do everything at once. Right. I think that
you don't need to do everything at once.
Yes, exactly. You can start with one thing and see how you feel with that one thing, and then progressively add in those habits and add in those behaviors. And, working with someone with us is really helpful, I think, because we're able to help you know what steps to take next, right? We can help you like kind of hone in on like, okay, this is going to impact your life the least to make this change. So let's do that first, and then we'll add onto it as we go. But yeah, that's, I think, always a little bit of an obstacle for Hashi warriors too, is it's so overwhelming. There's so much misinformation out there, and there's so much information out there.
Yes.
It's really overwhelming, and like where to start, right?
Exactly. And this is kind of leads us to my next question. Somebody asked, can I have some gluten, or do I have to be 100% gluten-free? Because I'm an Italian and I love my pasta. And that kind of, goes along with what you're saying. It is so overwhelming. Yes, you may start on a gluten-free diet, but then on the weekend, you get lost and you don't know, you give in into peer pressure when, if you don't have, if your friend's saying, oh, you don't have celiac disease, why are you following that? And if you don't know how to answer, that's a peer pressure that kind of will make you go, and eat all the gluten-rich meals. But just to answer that question, if you have to be 100% gluten-free, the short answer is yes, in my opinion. Well, not in my opinion, but in the research world, they showed, actually, before I answer that question, it's important to understand what happens in our body when we eat gluten. And there was a research done that shows that when we eat gluten, we have something that's called T-cell immunity activation. So there's IgG and IgA antibodies that are being released naturally in everybody's body. But in Hashimoto's people that are prone to food sensitivities, those antibodies are so high. And even though when you eat gluten, the gluten transit time is about only 52 hours. That's how long it takes for your food to get eliminated. But what the research shows that those IgA and IgG antibodies stay in your system for up to 60 days. So if you eat gluten during the week, or if you're gluten-free during the week, but eat gluten on the weekend, it's kind of defeats the purpose of being gluten-free.
Right. Absolutely. And what I would love to see too are studies on gluten tolerance, right? Because even with celiac, there's a parts per million that people with celiac can handle, right? So I would be so interested to see, because I've had clients who are gluten-free like 90% of the time, then they'll have a pasta dinner with their family like once every 3 months, and their antibodies have continued to trend down. So that like makes me wonder, like, what is the tolerance? Because I prefer my clients to stay 100% gluten-free just because we know how beneficial it is, right? But I would love to kind of see research, and I don't know if you've seen research on that, like what is the tolerance? What is the amount of gluten we can kind of get away with? We don't like, I recommend staying 100% gluten-free as much as possible, right? Because we just don't have that information. What the information we do have is staying gluten-free as much as humanly possible, right? Does have benefits for Hashimoto's in terms of this autoimmune disease, in terms of, the inflammatory process and the autoimmune process. So it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, Ingrid, this gluten-free diet, it has a lot of research behind it. But what about AIP diet? What do our listeners need to know?
This is a question that I get quite a lot too. It's very interesting because they've actually done research studies on AIP. Now, when AIP first came out, that's about around the time when I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's, about 5 years after my diagnosis, but I wasn't a dietitian yet. I had no idea what to do. So AIP seemed like the beacon of hope, right? It seemed like the one thing where we could take control. And it was like my first kind of like inkling of like, there's hope with this, right? Until I looked at what it what it involves. So that was number one. That was strike number one for me. And now that we have the literature, what we've learned about AIP is it actually does not benefit your thyroid any more than a regular gluten-free diet does, right? The only benefit to AIP is really reducing inflammation. And there are so many other ways to reduce inflammation without the intense restriction. So that's number one. And the second thing is with AIP, even if you wanted to do this on your own for a little while to see if it helps you, it's really important to know that this is not a forever plan. This is not a forever lifestyle. This is really restrictive. And the goal of this is really I don't really agree with the way that they, find food sensitivities in this way. There's better ways to do that too. But, if you're doing it on your own and you're not in the position to work with someone, this is something that you can definitely do on your own, but it is a short-term thing. It is not the way that you need to live for the rest of your life. And I think, knowing that is helpful because I feel like it can be so overwhelming and restrictive. And unfortunately, what we also know is that the more restrictive you are with the foods that you eat, the worse off your gut is going to be long-term. So your gut really needs a diverse amount of food in order to feed that diverse bacteria.
Yes, absolutely. All the great points. AIP should be a short-term solution to your food sensitivities. It's a great way to find out if you're sensitive to something, but it's definitely, in my opinion, leads to disordered eating. And it's not life sustainable. I mean, you can't participate in life events and family dinners and going to the restaurant if you follow this diet. And I was the same way as you. My first book I've ever bought was on AIP diet. And I thought that was it. This is going to solve all my problem. But then more research I did, I realized, well, it's only your goal is to decrease inflammation, is to reduce antibodies levels, right? To improve your gut health. AIP diet is probably the worst diet for gut health, just for the reasons you mentioned, because it's so limited and our gut bacteria needs diverse environment.
Yeah. And there's also no focus on blood sugar regulation either, right? Yes. So it's just about food choices. It's not really about, consistency of your meals or getting in enough protein, fat, and carbohydrates. There's no real focus on that. So it's also lacking from that perspective. But I think you had such a great point in terms of disordered eating. And that is something that I think so many women with Hashimoto struggle with. I struggled with disordered eating myself because you are living in this body and this body feels like it's betraying you, right? It feels like no matter what you do, no matter how many inputs of nutrition and dieting and exercise you put into this body, it's not responding in the way that you want it to. So it really does take a mental toll on your body image and also on, the way that you view food. And, one of the things that I think is so important is not coming at your Hashimoto's lifestyle from a place of restriction. And AIP definitely exacerbates disordered eating in people. I've had so many people coming to me, like weeping in the DMs or over voice clips because they just can't handle that AIP diet anymore. And, they felt like it was like the only option. So I think that that's really important to note too, that it is not the only option.
It is not the only option. It's hard to sustain and like like you said, there are other ways you can decrease inflammation. And going back to restrictive eating, Trish sent me a question when we asked for questions for this podcast. She said, how do you feel about eating rice and white potatoes with Hashimoto's? And my first thought was, I was like, this is the most common food. What else is out there besides potatoes and rice, right? So that's where the restrictions, the eating, not eating disorder, but disordered eating comes in, right? And I want to address these questions. Well, first, potato and rice are naturally gluten-free, right? Because we're talking about gluten-free diet, how beneficial it is for Hashimoto's. So they're naturally gluten-free. Potatoes have thyroid supporting nutrients like vitamin C, B6, potassium, right? Magnesium is a big one, iron and iodine. And rice, on the other hand, is a resistant starch. And it's simply put, it's the food for our gut bacteria. And like you mentioned, our gut bacteria needs a diverse environment and food. And rice just happened to be that good food that our bacteria feeds on. So, and I know some people avoid potatoes and rice because they're considered nightshade family. And honestly, there's no scientific evidence to date showing that nightshades vegetables cause inflammation. There's absolutely not. And like there's toxins that can be, or the stuff that it's in nightshades is toxic for people. There's no research behind it.
There's so much misinformation. And, I think where this gets off base is there's alkaloids, right, in these nightshades, and at high concentrated values, they can be toxic. But in the amount that you're going to get from a normal diet from eating a freaking potato, it is not going to be toxic at all. And you're missing out on one, a really convenient food, right? Yeah. Two, the only inexpensive foods that we have in our grocery stores right now is rice and potatoes. All of the micronutrients that you're getting, the fiber, all the micronutrients within those foods. So you're missing out on all of those things by being scared of a compound that you would have to eat truckloads of in order for it to have any negative impact on your body.
And probably you would have to eat it in raw state, because I know like all those toxins are in potato skin, in those in the things that grow out of potatoes, the little potato eyes.
Yeah.
But we all clean them up, right? And you cook the potatoes. So unless you munch on them in raw state, I would say enjoy that potato and rice and don't worry about nightshades.
Right. Agreed. And I think maybe they were asking from a nightshade perspective, but maybe they were thinking about like the higher glycemic end of things too. And I think that this is where it's so important to pair your foods, right? It's so important to pair your carbohydrates with a protein or a fat just to slow down that digestion, because carbohydrates are so important for thyroid health that it's important to get not too much of them, right? Because too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing, but to get in your moderate amount of carbohydrates, whether it's rice or potatoes or whatever you choose your carbohydrates to be, with a protein and a fat to just slow that carb digestion down. So I just wanted to note that as well, just in case that
absolutely.
was
Great point.
Yeah.
Yes, Ingrid, those are all great points, but let's move on to our next question so we can cover as many of them as we can. So Jacqueline asked me if she said, I have been recently diagnosed with Hashimoto's. How do I know what vitamin supplements to take? That's a good one. That's
a great question. And the answer is, it really depends, right? Like, would you agree with that? That like in terms of supplementation, there are some standards that we most often recommend, like making sure that you're getting in enough selenium. So either doing that through a supplement or through Brazil nuts. The most classic way of doing that is 2 Brazil nuts a day, right? We've all got that in the Hashimoto space. So selenium is so super important for our thyroid function. The thyroid gland contains more selenium than any other of our organs. And it's so important for the production of thyroid hormone as well. So selenium is a big one. Vitamin D, there's research showing that because women with Hashimoto's have higher levels of oxidative stress, we go through vitamin D a lot quicker. So especially for people who live in areas like I do. So I live in upstate New York, where we get the sun maybe like not 2 days a year, but it feels like,
right. So yes, you're not exaggerating, I don't think. Yeah.
I'm exaggerating a little bit, but our sun is not really at a great angle for natural vitamin D synthesis. So I generally will recommend a vitamin D supplement too, depending on where you live, depending on what your vitamin D levels are. But I find that it's really important to get these levels checked, because again, it's one of those things where too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing. So some other supplements that we might recommend is the B complex. The thing you want to watch out for with a B complex is biotin can impact your lab results. It doesn't impact your thyroid, but it can definitely show false low readings of your TSH. So you want to just make sure that if you're taking a B complex, you stop taking it about 2 weeks before your labs. I'm trying to think of other ones. Magnesium glycinate's a good one for just
zinc.
Yeah.
Iron, of course. Now, I don't recommend my clients taking an iron pill unless they get tested and unless they are under supervision of their doctor, because that's a tricky one. It gets, your body stores it, and it's very dangerous to have too much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so and constipation as well. So yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Add to the fire of constipation right there.
Truly with all trace minerals, right? Because even if you supplement zinc for too long and you're not pairing copper with it, it can deplete your copper stores. So really the more trace minerals you can get through nutrition over supplementation, I think is always preferred. Supplementation is not a magic bullet, right? It's very individualized as well. But I find that a lot of times we kind of get hooked on what can we supplement, what pills can we take, what powders can we take? But really, it's a slippery slope. And I think that a lot of my people come to me over supplementing, and I tend to pull a lot of supplements off and start to integrate, foods higher in these trace minerals into their nutrition versus supplementation.
Yes. It's hard I think it's hard to know exactly what vitamins and supplements you need to take, like our listener is asking, because you have to first understand how Hashimoto works and what it does to your body. So unless you have an extensive knowledge of the Hashimoto, how it causes low stomach acid, fat malabsorption, that's where the nutrient malabsorption, deficiency in digestive enzymes. So all of that, it has to play, it plays a huge part in what the vitamins and supplements we prescribe. And I always tell my clients, you have to test, don't guess. Get your blood work done, look at your signs and symptoms, work with a healthcare professional or licensed care professionals, and then come up with the plan. Don't just go to Walgreens and buy B12s because you think you may be deficient, or take, for low stomach acid, take supplements. I mean, it's like you said, it can backfire.
Absolutely. And I've seen it happen before. I'm sure you have too, where someone comes into you taking X, Y, and Z. And the thing that I see the most that has backfired is super supplementing iodine, because what we know from the literature is iodine can actually, if you take too much of it, it can trigger your antibodies. So, while iodine is really, really important for thyroid function, again, too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing. So that's one of the most common ones that I have to immediately pull off of my client's little supplement list.
Yes, exactly. So the bottom line is get tested, work with the dietitian or your doctor, and come up with the plan.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, now, since we kind of talked a little bit about low stomach acid and nutrient malabsorption and all that stuff, I had a great question. Somebody asked, why does Hashimoto causes so many digestive issues? And we've touched on some of them, but I think this is a good time to kind of summarize and maybe give a definite answer, right? Well, first we know the thyroid gland can definitely significantly impact our GI tract, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that low T3 does lower that stomach acid, which then allows foreign pathogens to enter our GI system, which can cause small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, which then leads to an inflamed gut, which leads to, leaky gut, right? So then you end up with all of these food intolerances. So it is a rather complicated process to kind of backpedal on that. And then I think that there's also other lifestyle impacts too that kind of worsen these issues. For example, cortisol levels, right? Like having high stress lifestyle, skipping meals, those types of things that can worsen those GI symptoms. And I'm not sure if you've seen that in your clients, but in my clients, I find that that is like stress is such a big one. Stress can absolutely impact that gut and impact those gut health symptoms as well. And we can't talk about the gut without talking about hydration as well. Right? So those are like the big ones, right? Is low stomach acid leading to SIBO, leaky gut, food intolerances, high stress, cortisol, skipping meals, and then also lack of hydration. Those are the biggest things that I say.
Absolutely. And was the stress one is the most obvious one, because when we all get stressed, and what happens to our stomach? We always say, oh my God, it feels like it's in a knot. We get so tense, like it's almost an immediate reaction. If with food, it may take you 24 hours to feel bloated or whatever. Stress, you can see it right there, right? And you can feel it. But yeah, so to add to what you're saying is also our thyroid hormone, of course, affects almost every system in our body. Our metabolism, right? Our muscles and everything. And we have trillions of cells in the body, and every cell has a thyroid receptor on it. So imagine if we don't have enough thyroid hormone, or we have too much, every system in the body, I mean, trillions of cells are affected at the same time. So guess what happens to our digestive system? It slows down, right? Constipation happens. And what we mentioned, the low stomach acid and acid reflux. And this is
absolutely. And so many people, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's such an interesting point, because so many people that I'm sure come to me, and they have reflux. So their doctor adds an acid suppressor, right? Like Protonics or whatever, and it doesn't take care of the issue. And that's because the reason for your reflux is actually low stomach acid, not high stomach acid. So it's so important to take care of your thyroid. And the other thing that, without like rambling too much, that I find so intricate and cool about the thyroid in general and gut health, that thyroid gut axis, is that they help each other, right? The thyroid helps the gut out. And then the gut, of course, is where most of our T4 to T3 conversion happens. So it's so important to take care of that gut health and take care of that thyroid so that they can help each other out better.
It's definitely a two-way street. You get one, a gut problem causes Hashimoto's. It has been proven, or may trigger Hashimoto's, and Hashimoto may trigger gut problems like leaky gut and all that stuff. But to kind of get back to the question about how does Hashimoto causes all this, why is this one of the diseases that we see so many digestive issues? And besides what we already mentioned, of course, constipation, right? The thyroid hormone affects the speed with how the food moves through our body. So the longer our food sits in our stomach, in our intestines, the more toxins we absorb back into our body. And that's where most of the skin issue come in. And I know at the beginning of this podcast, you mentioned cystic acne, and I've had the same thing. I was a 30-year-old woman with acne, like I was, I looked like I was 18, well, acne wise.
I know. And, it was honestly like, of course, the weight gain was a hit on my confidence, but I have to tell you, the acne was even worse. It was like, to me, because that's on my face, right? You can always buy clothes that make you feel confident and good and whatever, but like to have like that cystic acne on your face, it is the absolute worst. But yeah, once the gut was healed, the acne went away. So, but, kind of building on that constipation bit, the other thing that I think is so important to note, because like we get a lot of women in the perimenopause phase of life where there's like, spikes and dips of estrogen. And how do we I hate to use the word detox, but how do we remove extra estrogen, which is a fat storing hormone, but by pooping, right? Like we remove that extra estrogen by pooping. And if we're not pooping, that estrogen is kind of hanging out, and estrogen has a huge role in thyroid health as well. So it's just very interconnected.
Absolutely. Ingrid, since we're talking about pooping and stool and all that fun stuff, somebody asked if there is a way to get tested for leaky gut, because we know that a lot of people with Hashimoto's have a gut permeability, aka leaky gut. So is there any way we can test for it? And the answer is yes. Even though there's no standard test to measure that intestinal permeability, you can do a stool test. It's called GI map test, which I do with my clients. It measures the amount of zonulin. And zonulin is a substance that is secreted in your small intestines when we eat gluten. It's a normal process. Everybody does that. So the zonulin, a protein that it causes your intestinal walls, those cells, to the wall-tight junctions to open up. And if there's too much zonulin, it lets bacteria, pathogens, and food particles into your the space where the actual inflammation happens. It's called lamina propria in your gut. It's a very scientific term, but it doesn't go the gluten and dairy particles don't just go into your bloodstreams. It have to go through, inflammatory process there. But there is a way to test for it, and that's where it's called GI map test.
Cool. Awesome.
Yes. So next question is from Mariella. She's asking if Hashimoto is curable or treatable. Basically, why are we doing all these diets and testings and all that stuff? Like, are we trying to cure or treat Hashimoto's?
Yeah. So the unfortunate truth is Hashimoto's is not curable. Even if you get your thyroid gland removed, you still technically have Hashimoto's. It is an autoimmune disease, so it is treatable. There is the ability to go into remission where your antibodies are so low that it's no longer having impact on your thyroid. So that is possible. And that is something that many people are able to accomplish, as getting into remission with Hashimoto's. But it does take it takes a lifestyle nutrition and medication approach. Sometimes you don't need medication, but a lot of times you do, in order to get your body to go into remission. But long story short, unfortunately, it is not curable.
Yes, but the remission is a big one. If you're in remission, you can feel normal again. And while, the reason we want to follow the diet and eating anti-inflammatory food and everything that we covered today, the reason we want to do that is we want to minimize our chances of developing another autoimmune disease, because we know that people with Hashimoto's are just prone to develop celiac. And I mean, I can give you a list of other autoimmune disease, but it's just so daunting and scary that I don't even want to think about it. So the whole goal is to put that disease in remission.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why it's so important too, to have a sustainable approach to this, right? Like, it's so important to I always tell my clients, we're going to have Hashimoto's forever. So we need to learn to eat with Hashimoto's forever. So if what you're doing now is not something you're going to want to do when you're 90 years old, then maybe we need to reevaluate what you're doing. So I think that that's a really important point to kind of take home too, is it's so important to approach your nutrition, not as a diet, but as the way that you're going to be eating for the rest of your life.
Absolutely. Exactly. Sustainability of the diet and your lifestyle is is our main goal. And I think that's why it's important for people to work with somebody like us, with the registered dietitians, because we can guide them to the right direction and set them up for success, not just for next months, but for the rest of their lives. Because they, when I say they, we all, because we all have Hashimoto's, we need to learn how to live well with autoimmune disease. It's not going anywhere. So we need to minimize our chances, our risk factors, and just feel normal again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the take-home message here is that it's possible to feel normal again. It is possible to feel so good. And, we are living proof of that, right? We both have our hashi war stories of how we felt before we kind of pulled the pieces together. But, us and our clients are all living proof that it is possible to live a full, healthy, energetic lifestyle with Hashimoto's.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Well, Ingrid, thank you so much for participating, for spending your time on our podcast. I hope our listeners learned so much valuable information today. You're such a great resource. We will leave all of your information, your website, and your Instagram handle under our notes in our podcast so people can easily find you.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.